I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and the new BMW M2 behind me is much bigger and heavier than the vehicle that it replaces. But in today's video, I'm going to show you exactly why that just doesn't matter at all. And in 2023, the M2 is still one of the most entertaining, engaging, premium sports cars that money can buy. And it takes on a whole new level of importance when you consider that this is probably the last combustion M2 that doesn't have hybrid tech, and almost definitely the last one that you'll be able to get with a manual transmission here in Australia and around the world. The M2 that I've brought along with me is in a particularly nice specification, and in today's video we're going to take it for a cracking drive here on our private road at a private testing facility and on real Australian urban and country roads to see whether, despite the indulgent price tag, the M2 is a car that can do pretty much everything for you. We're going to unfold all those answers in today's video. Before we get started, hit subscribe down below, hit the notification bell, and let's lock in for a really fun episode of Chasing Cars. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. The old M2 was a special car, particularly at the end of its lifespan, where BMW started to refine the recipe with the competition and especially the awesome M2 CS, which we're hoping to see again in future. But where the new standard spec M2 takes a giant leap forward from its predecessor is in sophistication. Chassis sophistication, as we're going to come to in just a minute, but also interior sophistication. And that's necessary because the M2 now sits at a higher price tag. It's about 120 grand before options and on-road costs, so just over $130,000 drive away here in New South Wales. And that's the price of this particular vehicle as it sits, because this one is largely unoptioned, which is great. There's a very costly M-Carbon Experience option, which gives the car a pair of extremely supportive but pretty compromised and sometimes uncomfortable carbon bucket seats, and you also get a track day and a slightly higher speed limiter in the deal. I think it goes to 285 instead of 250, which is probably enough here in Australia. But in standard format, the M2 is actually a little luxury car as much as it is a sports car. Look at these gorgeous comfort seats here in Cognac tan Vanasca leather. They are incredibly comfortable. They hold you in with adjustable side bolsters. They've got memory, they've got heating. It is a beautiful car to sit in. You also have a round leather steering wheel with M stitching, carbon fiber reinforced plastic trim, and also immediate access to the M modes and big paddle shifters. Also true CFRP trim up here on the dashboard, and lots of nice materials, though it certainly isn't as luxurious as an M4, which gets extended merino leather. But still, look at the infotainment. Gorgeous curved display, bright enough to outshine any sun glare. 14.9 inches in the center. It's a touchscreen, or you can use the iDrive controller. Love that. And a 12.3 inch digital screen specifically for the driver, and Harman Kardon surround sound all included in the package. And as a car to live with every day, it's just wonderful because the seat is comfortable, the stereo sounds good. As we'll find out in just a moment, the adaptively damped ride is even compliant on the road. It's like you're starting to look for issues, and maybe one of those issues is a lack of customization. Now that the M2 is a lot more expensive, I think some people will expect to be able to build a custom spec. And the Mexican factory which produces the 2 Series, including the M2, cannot do BMW Individual paint colors yet, and there's only 5 colors for this car, which is really limiting. I'd love to see a spec in a BMW Individual British Racing Green, for instance, or a lovely navy blue, neither of which are currently available, and the jury is out on the question of whether BMW is going to do something about that. Personally, I hope they do, and I think they should, given this car's potentially last true combustion M2 status. In terms of practicality, it's good. We've got wireless phone charging, big cup holders, a big bin between the seats, big bottle holders, and possibly the biggest cheat code, which is 2 adult-sized seats in the back. It's a 4-seater, but it's a reasonably generous one at that. As we move around the backside of the M2 now, it isn't my job to tell you what does or doesn't look good in the built environment around us, but at least to my tastes, I really like the new M2. Opinion online seems to be split, but I like the basis of the current generation 2 Series. Nice looking car in my opinion, with these kind of 80s rally car aesthetics that BMW have chucked at it. Almost like a box fender and loads of squared off detailing front and rear. I think it's successful, and I think it's a better looking car than the M4, what with the buck teeth front end you are forced to take on that car. This is Brooklyn Grey. It's all right. It's got a slight bluish flat grey tone. I'd probably actually just go black, sapphire black, over the Cognac interior here. Now this one's got the 50th anniversary of M badge. Can't get that on new orders anymore, sadly. And then a silver M2 badge. I like the fact that it is silver rather than black. Huge quad tailpipes, and because the M2 is really more like a two-door sedan than a true coupe, you get a good boot. 390 litres of space, you'll get plenty of bags in there, and really impressively, BMW haven't dropped the ball on a bunch of practical stuff. The rear seats even fold 40-20-40 in this car, so you can still have 4 adults and something long in between. Look, I know a lot of people have pointed out the relative size and weight of the M2 compared to the old car, but it's hardly a behemoth, right? It's not an SUV, so this is still a manageable size, and it isn't out of control in the mass department. Now, the running costs are going to vary depending on what you do with the car. First, to petrol. It likes 98. 98 is expensive, but it's pretty frugal. On the highway, setting a good pace, you'll do like 8 litres per 100 Ks. I did on the way down to Canberra here yesterday from Sydney, and I was pretty happy with that. In town, of course, you can expect 13, 14 if you're driving it really hard, and sporty driving will be about the same, but it's not out of control. The warranty is 5 years with unlimited kilometres. Servicing, BMW will sell you an upfront servicing plan, but they won't tell you how much it's going to cost, at least publicly. So that's probably going to be quite expensive, particularly if you're planning to use this car as it really intends to be driven. And onto that point, things like brakes, things like tyres, if you're going to be tracking the vehicle, if you're going to be doing motor carners, you do need to draw up a bit of a budget for yourself and understand what it's going to cost, because this is a premium vehicle with excellent mechanicals. It's not going to be cheap if you want to wring its neck all of the time. So let's take the new M2, the bigger, fatter M2, out for a drive. Let's see if any of it matters and how much it changes this car. Now, I was actually really lucky to spend a lot of time in the old M2, the original one, the competition, and the CS, which was just fantastic. And in many ways, the CS could have stood for corrective surgery compared to the original, because it just became so buttoned down, particularly at the rear end, where the original M2 was heaps of fun, but it did struggle from a bit of a lack of compliance at times. But a very, very fun little car, a much smaller car, a lighter car, and a cheaper car. And I think that that is where maybe we can resolve a little bit of the confusion around the new M2 by simply admitting that it's a different car to the original, by effectively slotting the size into the halfway point between the old M2 and the current M4. The M2 has moved up a size class, and it's just a different kind of car to the original, which still was holding on to a little bit more of that scrappiness that came from being really quite small and being BMW's entry-level M product. I reckon these days BMW probably doesn't really think of the M2 as an entry-level car. It's not priced like one, and with all the fanfare that, you know, M performance versions of cheaper BMWs get, like, I don't know, the M2 35i Grand Coupe, which is significantly less capable than this car, the M2 is now allowed to be a little bit more premium. And I think that's exactly how it drives on the road. To me, the M2 is much more like a miniaturized M4 than it is an iteration of the old car, and that will either suit you or not. For me, for my tastes on the road, the new M2 is an order of magnitude superior to the old car, even taking into account the additional weight, the additional size, and the additional money. It's so much more sophisticated and refined and multi-talented than the old M2, which was more scrappy. And, you know, in certain environments, that probably meant that it could be a little bit more fun, even if it was a bit more sketchy. Whereas the new M2 is so much more refined, but it also gives you more options as a driver, partially through that refinement, but also for other reasons. I'm going to come back to that point in just a moment. First of all, let's talk about the engine, because that's one area where the M2 is very, very closely related to the M3 and the M4, because they share an engine. It's the S58 twin turbo 3-litre straight six, so M's version of the venerated BMW B58, if you like, We do have a bit less power here, less power than the least powerful M3, if that makes sense. So we have 338 kilowatts of power and 550 Newton meters of torque. So for a, still a relatively compact vehicle in 2023 terms, this amount of power is quite sufficient, I think you would say. We conducted performance testing at our private testing facility, and I was able to get 4.14 seconds from 0 to 100 out of the M2 with the 8-speed ZF torque converter automatic that we have here. And that is impressive for a vehicle which is rear-wheel drive only, because there is no all-wheel drive version of the M2. It's rear-wheel drive as your only option, but you can choose the transmission. Much like with the rear drive M3 and M4, you can go for this 8-speed auto or a 6-speed manual for the same price. Now the auto is fantastic, and I'll tell you why in just a second, but if I was ordering an M2, I would go for the manual, because everything we're seeing out of BMW suggests that this will be the last series production manual transmission car that the brand makes. Now that's not to say that they won't come out with a bunch of limited editions or special cars towards the end of the M2's lifespan, but this is probably it in terms of a car which is just a standard BMW M car that you can customize and order from factory as you want it to be made. And for that reason, I think you have to go the manual. But the auto, which is no longer a DCT, it's now a ZF torque converter, is just brilliant. The shifts are snappy, it won't shift up for you in manual if you don't want it to, and instead it's just a paragon of refinement with none of that low speed drivability issue that you often do get out of a dual clutch, even a very good dual clutch like the one in the old M2. But what you do get is the choice of transmission. The auto is actually fantastic, which I'll come back to in a moment, but I think I'd probably have to order the 6-speed manual if I was buying my own M2, because everything we're seeing tells us that this will be the last series production BMW with a manual transmission. They might do special models or whatever later on, but in terms of a car that you can just build and order as you see fit, this could well be it, so I'd be going for the manual. And I had an absolutely memorable drive in Europe from northern Italy to southern Germany about a year ago in a base M4 rear-wheel drive manual, and it was simply sublime. And I think that would be amplified even further in the new M2, so that's the way I would go. But the new torque converter ZF 8-speed auto is a gem. Lightning quick shifts. Shift down a few gears and I'll show you. It's almost as good as the old dual clutch in that regard, but with none of the low-speed drivability grumbles that were inherent in the old gearbox. So it is a gem, as is the engine. What an engine this is. For a turbo motor, listen. It loves to rev. 7,200 RPM rev limiter on this car, and it just pulls and pulls towards redline. It does not run out of puff. It is a seriously talented motor, and it's got so much punch in the mid and high range that when it comes to the quarter mile, which the new M2 automatic does in 11.91 seconds at 191 kilometers per hour, it only just trails an M3 Touring. It has serious brawn, this vehicle, and yet it's not boring to drive at the speed limit here in Australia if you find a good road, which of course we have done in order to test this car properly. It can be driven at or around the speed limit on a technical road without you losing interest, which I think is the mark of a really great car. Then there's the talent and the new sophistication in the chassis, which is adaptively damped as standard. The old M2, the basic versions, did not have adaptive dampers, and it didn't get them for a very long time as an option. This car arrives with them as standard, and it's certainly more civilized and supple and comfortable in the comfort mode of the adaptive dampers, and it's actually a really viable daily, a really viable road trip car. There is a bit of road noise, but on the highway it's not too bad, and the whole car just is efficient and relatively quiet and very comfortable in that environment. You can certainly firm up the dampers, and that is going to give you a bit more of the body control that you'll need on a back road, but the M2 does have a short wheelbase, considerably shorter than the M3 or the M4, and that is where you're going to feel a little bit more of that go-karty agility effect coming through in the chassis compared to the more grown-up M4, and I think a lot of people are going to like that. especially when you put the car into M dynamic mode, which relaxes the ESC and lets you get a lot of attitude on this vehicle, while still having some parameters that are going to keep you safe and not let things get too hairy. Of course, ESC can be fully deactivated, and you now have a 10-stage M traction control system for Motorcana work, for just pulling big burnouts if you desire at the cost of the tyres. But you can really choose your own adventure. You can drive the M2 a bit like an M4, very civil, really using the high amount of grip in this chassis, or you can be a lot more playful, and actually more playful than any M3 or any M4, largely thanks to that shorter wheelbase. It's a very fun car to drive with lovely steering as well. Clear steering, communicative, you know, still probably not up there with something like an E46 M3 from days gone by for feel or feedback, but for a modern rack, it definitely ain't bad. So this car has a lot of upside, very little downside. Yes, they are charging a premium price for it, particularly compared to the old M2, but I think it's a more premium and grown up and capable product that can do more for more people more of the time. So for me, while I'm not a BMW shill or investor, I'm an objective journalist, for me the higher positioning makes sense when you do consider exactly what it is that BMW have done for this car. It's a lovely little communicative driver's car, still not too big, and that extra pork, that extra weight, you're hard pressed to feel it in 95% of driving scenarios. That's simply the way it is. Now lastly, a note on the safety. It's pretty good. We've got a slightly more basic lane keep system than in the M3 or the M4, but it does sort of keep you in your lane and stays out of the way the rest of the time, which is exactly what you want. We've got adaptive cruise, which is very smooth. We've got blind spot monitoring and AEB, so the safety game has moved on from the old M2, but not in a way which gets in the way, which is absolutely perfect, isn't it? So with all of these virtues, plus the impending anxiety that it's probably going to be the last of its kind, the last truly awesome non-hybrid, non-electric M2, a vehicle that gets so much right and is so balanced, premium, yet sporty, cosseting and supple on the highway, yet with a firm and hard edge on a country road if you want it. It shouldn't surprise you at all that the M2 is a car which earns the coveted Chasing Cars Gold Star Award. It is a superstar of semi-affordable performance motoring. Of course, I'm not going to look you in the eye and tell you that 130 grand drive away is cheap, because it isn't. But this kind of engineering depth, this kind of talent, with a brand new car warranty is not something we see every day here on Chasing Cars. And if you're in the market for a vehicle like this, you must consider the new BMW M2. And frankly, I'm considering it myself. Very keen to know your opinion, so please let me know down below in the comments. While you're there, hit subscribe if you've enjoyed this video and the notification bell. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.